representatives, distinguished participants, good morning. My name is John Mwangi, and I'll moderate the next session. The next session is panel 5 on your program. The panel is focused on navigating challenges and shaping solutions. And at the end of it all, we hope to pick key recommendations. In the past 1.5 days, we've had opportunities, just as a way to foreground these discussions. We've had opportunities to engage in conflict analysis of the Sudan. Yesterday, we had different presentations that really looked at, what are the stakes, who are the conflict actors, what are the issues, what are the dynamics. And then across the panels, we had opportunities to listen to representation from intergovernmental organizations, government officials, and so on. So today, in this session, we will attempt to pick recommendations. The session is supposed to end at exactly 12:30. So without further ado, I would like to invite the two presenters for this session, and then thereafter we'll have the plenary. To speak to us in this panel, the first presentation will be by Dr. Duncan Ojwang. He's the Dean, the African Nazarene University Law School. He will speak to reflections, or he will reflect on the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the African Union, and the United Nations efforts within the shaping solutions dynamics. The second presentation will be by Professor Zakaria Osman Ramathan, who is the president of the Chadian Center for Strategic Studies and Prospective Research, but also with keen interest in this region. So he'll speak to key recommendations for notable regional and international actors. I now invite Dr. Duncan Ojwang to the floor. Prof, you will have 15 minutes to make your presentation, and then I'll invite Professor Zakaria Osman. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Good afternoon. What can we say about Sudan and the issue of effective intervention? Almost everything has been said, and so I have to find the very few areas that we can have a conversation so that we don't repeat what has been said. In September 27th, 2017, that will be how many years? About 5, 6, was my first time in Sudan, in first intellectual forum under the theme Political Stability in Africa, Constraints and Prospects of the Future. We were in Khartoum, we stayed in Corinth Hotel, we went to the new military institute, the beautiful one, and the discussion then was first intellectual forum under the theme Political Stability in Africa, Constraints and Prospects of the Future. It was attended by His Excellency Obasanjo, attended by Ali Hassan Mwinyi, and all this group. And I still remember President al-Bashir standing up to say that the greatest gift God has given the people of Sudan is to turn his enemies into brothers. And we felt that what happened is a miracle. And I remember writing an article around that around the African fireplace, Sudan has finally found the solution. A few years ago, al-Bashir was overthrown. Another crisis. A few years later, Corinth Hotel, I saw news, bombed, the most beautiful hotel. And so, the contradiction, the oxymoron, when we thought things were in a steady, stable path, but the reality of today contradicts all of that. General Sumbeyo, who did a lot of work in South Sudan on behalf of Kenya, after peace, after everything happened, the Naivasha Accord and all that, he said he had one regret, that when he did things about South Sudan, he was thinking as a soldier. And he did not build or work with a bigger team that looked beyond almost stopping the hostilities. That was probably very candid of him, and probably one of the main regrets that he's expressing. Because you know that a few years, and even now, the situation in South Sudan is still that of people are nervous, people don't know what is going to go on. The path to peace, stability, democracy is not very clear. Beside all those efforts, of course, that were successful to some extent, of giving the country referendum, starting a joint government, it's almost like things are stuck. So I wanted us to briefly look at the situation in this sense. Dr. Chanda gave us what IGAD has done. Dr. Singoei, yesterday the PS, gave us what Kenya and some of the member states have done about Sudan as a resolution. The three paths. Is it having one country lead this conversation? And in fact, before I get to that, somebody said that you can't leave those who created the problem in charge of the solution. Sounds cheap, it's a bumper sticker, you can put it on your Toyota, but to what extent is it reflecting some truth? That if you are the problem, you cannot be at the same time the solution. So I'm looking at the three paths that IGAD can have, whether it is to directly have within their staff some team leading the mediation. Do they have the capacity? We now know from Dr. Chanda the preference that they have almost mix of special envoy and the IGAD member states being involved. But my question is this. Dr. Mwagiru said that the issue of Sudan cannot be resolved until those internal and external actors, and especially external actors, find a way that come out of the shadows and be part of mediation. I don't know how, but as we talk of a Sudan-led process and say these are the warring factions, you sit here and give us a Sudan solution. But we know also very well that there is so much interest and actors beyond these people at the table. And as we take the usual path of doing what we call dialogue or bargaining, and preoccupied with the usual bargain between the warring factions, because that is what usually is easier and preferred. To what extent can we create an enduring peace if those other actors are not involved in this mediation, and we keep almost acting like we don't see that we have so many other actors, external, invested, interested, to some extent almost factional, because of economic, because of all other interest. How genuine is this bargain, and what do we really expect when we talk of a Sudan-led process? And let us lock the room and only have the Sudanese talk. Yet, we know in the back of our mind that there are other very serious actors actively involved, actively influencing, and to some extent even calling the shots. And to me, that is the contradiction. I don't have the solution. Should we just say, you know what, let us be honest, if we look at the countries within IGAD, we know some have been more involved in the Sudan issue than the rest. If we look at the geopolitics, if we look at the international interest, can we succeed when we pretend that we are talking of a Sudan-led process and a Sudan solution when we have these third parties that are very intimate, very influential, and to some extent leading the process? And that led to what the PS was talking about of forum shopping. That it's almost that if you look west or east and you look at this mechanism, you can see the interest there. And if you look at this one, you can see the interest there. And so the problem of finding true mediators without just using words for the sake of it and make us feel good that this is an African-led process. Yet, to be honest, we know that it is partly an African solution for some of the problems created out of Africa. So how do we have a mediation that reflects the true situation in Sudan? And I started by saying the theme of our conference about Africa's stability and all that in 2017. And you know that that was, as they say in Kenya, hot air. And we almost, what one commentator defined as fantastic phonies and fabulous fakes. Fantastic phonies and fabulous fakes. You know very well you are interested in Sudan. You are all the way in there. You stay behind. You are saying this is a Sudan-led process. You are the one commanding these generals. And then we are saying we are finding Africa solution for Africa problem. I don't have a solution, but I think that our mediation should start from a point of view of being honest, of acknowledging the true dynamic, not the picture we want, that all the actors, whether it's primary actors or secondary actors, are on the table, at least to some extent are acknowledged, and give this process goodwill. Otherwise, we are having forum shopping. So imagine what I was saying, if the people who have created problem cannot resolve it. So you are, the generals have even audacity to say, I don't want that forum. And to what extent then are we going to have the issue of justice? Because at this point, they dictate the terms. They are at the table representing a very big interest, going up to the mediation or the mediators or the right forum. But then there is a lot of atrocities as we had, a lot of people who have. So to what extent will we finally have evidence collected, and will we have the issue of justice and the issue of maybe people who have to answer for being involved in combat without observing principle of proportionality, humanity, distinction, and all those principles that we know are in IHL. If they are at the same time almost driving the process, and we have said that that process belongs to them, to what extent will they be answerable? Or will there be any chance of finding out who played according to the IHL and who did not? Let me conclude by two observations. Are we going for settlement or resolution of the conflict? Because those are two different things. Are we talking about settlement or resolution? If we are to settle, is to resolve and manage powers, but when you talk of resolution, we might have to go much deeper beyond the power relationship between the warring factors. So we have to be very clear, and IGAD must be very clear that is it settlement or resolution? And finally, peace process should not end at the negotiating table. At least we have learned that lesson. Conflict, if followed by peace, then it must be nurtured. Peace management approach must be inbuilt from the beginning, so that whether the conflict is settled, there is a more long-term process. My view is that IGAD could do a good job. Some of the states might be a little bit conflicted, but let us go beyond just the semantics of this is a people-driven, Sudan-driven, yet we also know in the shadow there is tons of interest that make it very difficult to see whom really you are talking to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ojwang, for those wonderful reflections. In summary, Professor Ojwang is acknowledging the complexity of the mediation process and speaks to the question of mapping the actors very well and their interests, but also introduces two very quick dynamics there, the issues of justice and reflecting also to the place of international humanitarian law. He leaves us with two quick recommendations, more of questions. Are we going for settlement or resolution of the conflict? And towards the end, makes a very strong case for sustainable development. So acknowledging that conflict resolution is a short-term process that then should open the way for longer-term conflict management. We can keep that in perspective as we move to the plenary for recommendations. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Zakaria Osman Ramathan to make his presentation. Team, please make the slides available for Professor. And Professor, your 15 minutes commence the time the slides are on.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, I'd like to join other colleagues to thank the Horn Institute and Conrad Adenauer for inviting us to share our view, experience in this particular case regarding Sudan, a country where I worked for years, a country that I like very much, and it is painstaking to see Sudan in the brink of war. The most difficult thing is either to be the first presenter or to be the last presenter. In this particular case, I have to conclude this debate. And what I'm going to say has been already rehearsed, has been said by other people. There is a trap. The trap is to be redundant and then to repeat what others have been said, or to be generous, to create something in your own, and then try to add a value addition to the discussion. And what I'm going to say is that regarding Sudan, the situation that we have in hand is the crisis. So we will go from, instead of going from the root causes, we go from the consequences of something that happened. I'm sorry, I cannot find my PowerPoint. Anyway, so let me just go back to what the first one slide, can you please? This is Sudan. It's a map that everybody knows, but map should be interpreted. When a country is large, the tendency is always to have a problem from west to east because of natural resource access and control of natural resource. And when a country is long, the problem is moving from north to south. You are bound to go into different strata of ecosystem. And then you will have a problem of ethnicity and problem of getting into a new ecosystem which is not yours. In the case of Sudan, Jinena, which is western part of Sudan, is much closer to N'Djamena in Chad than to Khartoum. And when you take Kassala for Sudan, Kassala is much closer to Asmara than to Khartoum. And then we have the centrality of this map is that we are in a situation where the size of the country could be a constraint. And the area where the capital is located is extremely important as to pull together the whole nation as a whole. Let's move to the next. And David Mitran wrote in 1943, I'm sure there is no one who's born in 1943, this one. And he said the problem of our time is not how to keep nations peacefully apart, but how to bring them actively together. But the success of bringing states together in regional international organizations is not to bring them together only, but to handle dispute and maintain peace and stability. I will proceed that indeed, the management of conflict in Africa has been a subject of significant concern to the world community. I think everybody knows what happened in Liberia way back in 1989, 1990. One of the earliest of the post-war crises in Africa was a particular vicious civil war in Liberia, a conflict lasting from 1986 to 1997. Despite the killing, the mass killing, the developed world refused to intervene. Instead, Liberia, West African neighbor, which is ECOWAS, have to move organized military intervention and to stop the 8 years war. And this military intervention has been criticized. This is the paradox. Albert Einstein said, the paradox in this life is that you want to do something and expect a different result. Here we have a case in point where there was a civil war going on in a given country, and the regional organization move in with the military intervention and yet has to be seriously criticized. It reflects an African attempt to address the African conflict situation who waiting for the assistance or external pattern. Let me tell you that Africa is divided with the typology of Africa is that we have 5 types of African country. The functional state, I think there are about 7. The semi-functional state, 11. And the remaining are classified either between failed state, collapsing state, or collapse and virtual state. Those are basically the typical region. So I don't know where does Sudan lie, but Sudan somewhere is not, is neither functional or semi-functional. It's somewhere. So. Next to the second move. So, politics, governance, and the people. Sudan is the 3rd largest African country. That is something new. Not new, everybody knows. It has 8 million agricultural land, a population of about 45 million, and of which 60% are under 35. But the thing is that Sudan has a history, a long history of political violence. Since its independence in 1956 to 2020, Sudan only had 8 to 12 years of peaceful existence. If it's not a coup, it's either drought. If it's not a drought or coup, it's definitely civil strife, civil war. If it's not a civil war, it is definitely flooding. So you are in a situation where you have a country who has only 10 to 12 years existence to strike a nation building. This is Sudan. So the primary source of instability in Sudan is a lack of security. I work in Sudan, and this is something that we did it in 1998, and it's still true. One of this is the insufficiency of well-trained, equipped, and controlled security apparatus to cover the whole country. Sudan is a huge country. You have more ungoverned areas that govern under the control of the area under the current government. No sustained presence of military in most rural areas. So that's pushed people to arm and defend themselves. You have the lack of freedom of movement. Sudan and Central African Republic are considered to be the most isolated country in the world. Transborder family provide safe haven to bandits and criminals. When you take the Sudan border, you have people moving in and out, and who are out of control from either side, either Sudan or the neighboring country. Lack of livelihood. Education is misaligned with job market. Lack of secondary and tertiary economy. No access to credit capital. Low agricultural yield and subsistence agriculture. Sudan covers only 60% of its food need. So since the early 1980 till now, Sudan has been in the food aid, has been almost a basket case. And here you have a country which has 80 million of hectares of agricultural land. Endemic food insecurity, malnutrition, starvation, and increasing population straining water and land resources. The competition for land and water resources is likely to be with the Sudanese for some time because you have an increasing population and you have a diminishing natural resources. Lack of potable water, deficit of political leadership, access to and devolution of power by non-constitutional means. I will definitely ask Dr. Sati to correct me, but Sudan had 4 coups d'etat, Aboud, Nimeri, Swaredab. Successful. No, I'm not talking about the notion. 4 coups d'etat, Aboud, Nimeri, Swaredab, and al-Bashir. I'm not counting this, the 2 gentlemen. That is the case. So it's a culture of political violence. So power, access to power in Sudan cannot perceive through the ballot box, but through the political means. You have to have the gun. Owning gun is part of the Sudanese culture to get access to it. So lack of potable water, and then Sudan misfortune is to be located in a fragile regional political environment. 6 out of the 7 neighboring countries of Sudan are either failed state, collapsing state, or collapsed state. This is a misfortune. The worst thing to have in life is to be, to have a neighbor who is in trouble or he's poor, and that people have tendency to move from this area to area as they will definitely come to Sudan. This is one of the problems. So Sudan's main struggle is about issue of public governance, lack of accountability, and weak rule of law. This is a very, very, very peculiar, not only to Sudan, to most African countries, but it's more pronounced in the case of Sudan, where I worked for years and said, you have selective impunity, you have a selective justice in Sudan. So you have people who are accountable and those who are not accountable. So that will take us to the state capture, the competition for the state capture. You want to be among those who cannot be accountable to the state. Okay. The regional group traced their origin in the mid-60s. Do you know that there are about 217 regional and sub-regional organizations in Africa? 217. So, most of them are semi-functional, collapsed, or simply virtual. Most are being surviving. Those are the regional organizations that we have. Most of them not working. But when you look at their mandate, one of them will say, promote peace and stability, and then early warning system. None of them is working because the state, the regional organizations are nothing that the reflect of the countries themselves. So if you are in a situation like in Sudan, where you are a failed state, then the organization to which you belong is likely to be a failed institution. It will not anticipate. You cannot have early warning system. Let's move, okay. So this is the typology of the international cooperation, the international cooperation, and the regional and sub-regional cooperation. But the state have, moreover, the responsibility, any state has the responsibility, first of all, to protect its citizens. If you don't, you are not in a position to protect the population against fear and need, and then you are no longer de facto a responsible state. In the case of Sudan, most of the people defend themselves, they are left by themselves. So therefore, we are in a situation where the state itself has no relevance to the population. So what is happening in Khartoum, the fighting between Al-Burhan and Himeti engaged the 2 gentlemen. But when you go back to the area, in Darfur, in Kordofan, wherever it is, then you have people who are not accountable to neither Himeti nor Al-Burhan. And this is the complexity of the Sudanese crisis. We are in a situation where those who command the civil staff do not have any possibility to stop the war. Good? Yeah. Conflict can be managed through formal and informal. Again, we said it during this. The informal system in Sudan is more than even the formal. This is the organization of the civil society. So basically, the organization of civil society took over from the state its own responsibility. The whole of Sudan is being managed, in the rural is being managed by the organization of the civil society. So the second is that the organizations that are tightly controlled by their member state are inoperant, inefficient. However, the organizations that are independent of the political economic section tend to be more successful in acting with legitimacy. But you have, in this area, all of them belong to the government. Government is a member of the organization. The IGAD is one of the typical area where Sudan is a member of the IGAD. But at the same time, you have non-government organizations who can foster peace, but cannot be associated to the peace building in Sudan. Okay, good. So let's go to the way ahead. The way ahead is that peace in Sudan should not be seen as only the absence of war. So the primary focus should be in confidence and peace building. Peace building confidence takes time and should be done on the basis of complementary and division of labor of all stakeholders. The second is the partnership. The local partnership, the organization of the civil society should be in the front line to empower the citizen inside and the action and the interaction. At the regional level, you have the sub-regional level, including Egypt and Chad. Somebody said it yesterday, and Nuruddin, emphasized this. And you cannot have a peace, some kind of peace in Sudan without involving Chad. And then you move to the synergy on the basis of comparative advantage. And the ownership, African Union led and driven by the African Union, peace is most likely to succeed than something that was imported. It should be coordinated at the regional and international effort. The political aspect as much as the humanitarian aspect. Let's move, I think. Much more cost-effective to prevent conflict. Early warning and prevention have to do with the quality of leadership and governance. Today, there are simply not enough data to explain all aspects of the international interaction between regional cooperation and conflict management. That's unfortunate, it's not true. We cannot say that such an regional organization was successful on broken peace or preventing this. It does not happen, we don't have any. The early interest, the future conflict developed, the international community should not underestimate the value of international mandate that lend an important authority to any intervention. We should have the possibility to intervene militarily to stop the killing in Sudan, in one way or another. The second, by being able to eliminate directly faulty assumptions about the correlation, the cost of regional and international cooperation can be diminished by politically and economically driven projects. This will create a better understanding why the conflict management and conflict resolution mechanism in Sudan has not succeeded to date. It will not work. It has not worked. We have to reinvent the system. We cannot depend on those local regional setups which are not working. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor did give us very excellent perspectives on this conflict, again echoing similar themes that have been shared in this conference, the complexity of the conflicts in the Sudan, but he also adds into the lexicon of our discussions here terminologies around how we define our states, are they failing, are they failed, and so on, but also being careful around the language, because it also requires, or it would call for certain interventions if you call a state failing or fail, but that's an observation. Prof ends with, on a positive note, he speaks to important conversations, especially at the level of the African Union. He's speaking to the principle of subsidiarity, complementarity, but also comparative advantage. So these are also important discussions to hold. He's also making a case for the African Union-led peace efforts. He's speaking to coordination, speaking broadly also to conflict prevention, and he also made a case for early warning mechanisms. When he's diagnosing the conflict in the Sudan, he is also making a case for rethinking the social contract. And so he's really had an opportunity to look at how states ought to function, and therefore in his recommendations he's speaking to looking at the politics, but also economic development, but also confidence building measures over time, acknowledging that sustainable peace will take a long time. I end on a note where he also speaks to informal conflict management systems, and he seems to privilege civil society actors a lot, in addition to speaking to the other actors. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, I would like us to take a couple of questions that are very specific to the two papers, and then we'll open the plenary for the wider recommendations. Let me see by some hands if you'd like to engage with the two presentations before we can get to the plenary. So I have microphones. I have one ambassador here. We could take a couple of 3-4 questions or comments this end. All right, the ambassador is preparing to make his points. Yes. Yeah. Please keep them short and direct to the speakers as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, well, Professor Ojwang raised some important issues. The issue of sincerity about a Sudanese-led process and what would be the part played by the Sudanese themselves and what would be the part played by the mediators. And I would like him to further elaborate on this because we are grappling with this right now in our interaction with the African Union and IGAD to some extent. We are trying to identify the role that civilians would play in the process. And some of us think that when you say Sudanese-led, that means that nobody should interfere in what you are doing, which of course, in mediation, as we know it is not possible. If you have a problem, somebody has to assist you to resolve it. So what would be the degree of this assistance, this interference, I would say, and what would the professor advise as to the interaction between the national actors and the mediators? To Professor Zakaria, who knows Sudan very well, actually he's partly Sudanese, like many Chadians, and he knows Sudan maybe better than even myself. Now, Zakaria, you have worked in the region, you have worked in Sudan, you have worked in Chad, in the Sahel region. How do you see the dynamic, the regional dynamic, the interferences between the Sudanese situation and the Sahel situation, particularly around Lake Chad, and the populations that the Sudanese are saying, oh, those Janjaweed are mostly from Chad and from Niger and from Cameroon and from... what's your personal assessment of this allegation, I would say? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Ojwang, would you like to take this question around the Sudanese peace process? And how does it look? And the recommendations you could make. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, if it was up to me, I would have switched the question to my co-panelists to be mine. It's easier and more straightforward than this one. We have accepted that there are multiple actors, interests, and players. When you look at the epicenter of the Sudan conflict, then you also admit that it cannot be resolved until all those actors find a place at the table, because because of how complex the conflict is. Now, what do I suggest? I don't have a magic bullet or a clear answer. As a lawyer, we say it depends. It depends with the facts and what we want to achieve. But I think, to me, it was more of a clear warning that we can't go far if we take the mode of bargaining between the two main military forces and ignore the other shadowy figures. Exactly what role they can take, that one I think I will have to do further research on that, and I don't want to wing it. Finally, I also think that you know that responsibility to protect that the second presenter gave, build morals by Africa, ECOWAS have used it very well. We also know that power deters power in IR, and therefore I think it is time for long term to think about using this responsibility to protect more actively in terms of military intervention, so that if there is that military intervention, then we can talk of more transitional justice. We can now talk of collecting evidence. But if we don't have military intervention like now, it appears that because the two sides which have guns are actually calling shots, and therefore whatever we are getting is more else within their shadow. We know that power deters power. Thank you.
I request the two panelists to please join me on this high table so that we can see them. Sorry, there's a question? Yes, I'm coming to that. If you could just sit there, so that we can have a coordinated. There are a couple of questions coming. Prof. Zakaria, maybe you can hold. We take another set of questions and then, or you'd like to respond first?
Okay, sure. Why not we go for the second round and then I'll take it up.
All right. Ambassador?
It's not fair to make it fair. I want to ask about the objective, actually. What I expect
Okay.
was that we would hear what IGAD is doing. We've been saying IGAD all the time. It's pretty done.
All right.
And I can ask it, actually. And what everybody has been talking from the beginning, including IGAD, is talking that it will take the initiative and has been given the initiative. What has IGAD done so far? I know IGAD. Many of us actually from the region do know IGAD. IGAD as an institution has not been the most functional or regional organization when compared to other regional organizations. But IGAD's strength has been on the on the countries that chair IGAD. When it was the first solution, for example, for Sudan, it was Kenya representing IGAD. And Kenya did it, it had legitimacy. What was important about IGAD was the legitimacy it gave to Kenya to act on behalf of IGAD. The same thing with Ethiopia later on, when it dealt with South Sudan, the problem with South Sudan. It dealt with it in the name of IGAD, but actually it is Ethiopia. As an institution, well, not much, but the weight it gives to individual members that have the weight to do so has been critical. Now, I had wanted to hear, actually, because of the topic, what has been the efforts and what are the objectives and efforts now also of IGAD, the AU, and the UN. And I didn't get much actually done. And hopefully we will talk about these on the conclusions on the last aspect. So if we could combine, I think would be a good way to get at something tangible. How do we move from here? What are the plans actually to move from here? This is what I think a lot of people want to hear.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those interventions. Let me assure the room and Your Excellency that we are coming to a session where we pick recommendations and actions coming out of this meeting. And I believe at the conclusion section, we'll be able to have maybe a communique. I don't overplay my role, but some statement coming out of this meeting. And I believe we will have this discussion in a short while on very, very practical recommendations. And if you look through the program, we have a section where we make recommendations that are staggered in 4 different ways. So please hold a little bit onto that. I would like Professor Zakaria to respond. And then now we'll open the floor for very clear practical recommendations. Ambassador, I take your concerns very, 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 very well. That, I think you're looking at the intent of the program and maybe how the papers should have been. But sometimes presenters have, leeway, to move around. But we'll come to that so that we leave this meeting with very practical recommendations. Professor Zakaria, you have the floor.
Yeah. Back to Ambassador Sati said, the linkage or some kind of relation between what is happening in the Sahel and Lake Chad and Sudan. I mean, one should keep in mind that you have in all of this part of the world what you call the human continuity with institutional discontinuities. You move from Chad, a country, to Sudan. This is not a country, but then you find the same human fabric in both sides. It's true between Sudan and Chad, but it's more so between Chad and Nigeria, and so forth. So the claim that those are Janjaweed demonstrate the fact that the Sudanese themselves don't know themselves. They don't know each other, frankly speaking. Sudan is so large, as I initially said, that the guy who is in Khartoum, 1,500 kilometers away from his own brother who is in Sudan and Chad border, wouldn't know exactly the difference. For him, this guy is more Chadian, although he said that fully. So this kind of things, I think it's a very, very quick assumption, unfounded assumption. I think the Sudanese problem remains Sudanese, and Chadian are definitely busy sorting out their own problem, and so on and so true for Niger in the Sahel. I think there's that. But this human continuity within the state or the institutional discontinuity create a lot of confusion among many people.
Thank you very much, Professor Zakaria. I would like us to give a round of applause to our 2 panelists for raising the discussions. They may resume their seats, and now we'll open the session to the plenary.
Thank you for your leadership.
Yes. And so what we will do now, I know in the last 1.5 days, we did have a look at the conflict analysis. The different papers have, the different presentations rather, have examined the actors, they've examined the dynamics. There have also been presentations by different agencies looking at some of the actions, the strategies that are ongoing and so on. So I hope we can use this session now to move things a little forward in terms of very pointed recommendations. And because we have also different actors in the room, so for instance, IGAD has been mentioned here, quite a lot. So as we open now the floor for that kind of engagement, if you'd be very, pointed to the kind of actions we would want, to be taken so that we all collectively think about the conflict resolution in the Sudan. So the floor is open. We'll start with that end. So we could take the first round of recommendations.
Yeah,
Please go ahead, yeah.
thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, there has been a lot of talk during this conference about, how to mediate, how best to address the root causes. I think what we need is an arms embargo, no? As long as countries like Egypt or United Arab Emirates, supply, the violent factions with weapons, there's no need for any mediation. First, you need to stop the conflict by making sure no arms can reach the variant factions, and then can take it from there. Also, the other thing is, which is not clear, that also came up yesterday, it's not clear what the end game for Burhan and Hamiti are. So that's another thing to find out. It's difficult to start a process or timeline or mediation if as long as the two, warlords or two conflict parties are still willing to continue to fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have some sort of, yes, Ambassador Sati? Sorry.
There has been quite, I think, a lame approach to a very devastating war in Sudan from the institutions, beginning from the UN, the AU, and IGAD, when it is one of the most horrendous wars that are going on actually in the continent. It is the most active war, the most destructive war that is going on in the continent right now. I can't say in the world, but and yet the reaction has been really not up to the issue, up to the problem. Now, we were very happy to hear that eventually the AU and IGAD have agreed to collaborate to start an IGAD, not IGAD-led actually, AU and IGAD together will act actually on this issue. And the UN has said, Europeans and everybody has said that we expect an African lead on this issue, and there would be support actually to whatever. So it does give, the ball is squarely in the court of the African institutions that have themselves been saying we want actually, to be in the lead, and the entire world, okay, good, do it. We would support. And I would have liked to know, there was actually from the Kenyans, I have said IGAD means whichever country is really the chair of IGAD. And that has not only legitimacy of the organization, but also when you have a government dealing with it and not an institution, then it has certain powers. It can utilize these powers in the service of the, and we've been expecting actually that there would be some clarity, some clear, in other words, steps Kenya plans to take as a lead on this organization. The entire world is looking actually at that. And I get calls from the UN, from everywhere, as an individual who's been actively engaged in the region. And we have not had yet a clear indication of exactly what are the steps Kenya used to, plans to take. For example, the appointment of a special envoy that would, a president, of course, you want the weight of the president, but the president is not going to run, mediation, is not going to run around to find out the positions of different Sudanese actors, for example. This has been awaited, and I just wanted to know from Kenya as the lead in IGAD, what are the steps that are planned, and when will they start? How will they move? It has not been clearly expressed, and I think that expression, that need, would be something an organization, a meeting like this could recommend, could pass as a resolution. But it would be good to hear if there's somebody
Thank you, Ambassador. And I believe we have representation from MFA. Maybe they can, at the right time, if they would like to engage, that would also be fine. I'm looking at this side. Yes, Ambassador said. There's a microphone coming to you.
Thank you very much. You have asked us to make, to pinpoint our recommendations. So let me offer 4 or 5 recommendations under these subtitles that have been recommended in the program. Under humanitarian, I would recommend more resources, and see how the shortfall in the funding can be salvaged in a manner that would really meet the needs of the population. We might need better coordination between or among international regional actors concerning humanitarian issues, and advocacy with the government, because we know that there are some hurdles created by the administration and by the government, and many concerns about the role of HAC, the Humanitarian Coordination Agency of Sudan. This has been with us for some time. So how the humanitarians can and their supporters can advocate for more transparency in the distribution of humanitarian assistance in allowing access and providing visas and such issues. On the political front, I would recommend better collaboration between AU and IGAD and Sudanese actors. As I said earlier, we are still to know exactly, as my dear friend Haile has repeatedly expressed, more transparency and more engagement with the Sudanese actors, particularly the civilians that we represent, and to come together and to agree on a common approach to the process and to see how we can support IGAD and AU efforts on this, and we recommend more transparency than in this respect. The other, on the diplomatic front, the combination of political probably and diplomatic, better coordination of regional and international actors. This has been repeatedly, also expressed in our discussions. We would like really, and this is a call, an appeal to regional and international actors to work together in order to have a coordinated and harmonized approach to the mediation in the Sudanese crisis. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to find, to get to this. On our side, as civilians, we would like to assure a point of information our partners that we are inching towards a kind of an agreement among the civilians. Not later than last night, we had a meeting in which we have discussed our plan of action, our program for the engagement in the talks, and what we call our negotiating strategy that we have adopted within a coordination committee, and then we are sending out the various components to agree upon, and we, including the political actors, and we think and we hope that within probably the next 10 days we can come out with a unified approach to the talks. Security, and this of course the major issue here, as we all know, is the issue of protection of civilians. How do you protect civilians in Darfur, in West Darfur particularly, are exposed to some kind of ethnic cleansing? How do you protect civilians in Khartoum and other areas? And of course, this is a tough issue to deal with, but we are calling for a kind of serious reflection on what it takes to protect civilians in Sudan, and whether this idea of deployment of protection force can fly, and what are the conditions for it. To my mind, it cannot work without an agreement, a ceasefire agreement between the two belligerents and taking them in and getting their approval to that kind of action. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sati. Do we have some more? Dr. Walter, you like to speak a bit? Yes, and then I'll try and summarize a bit of what the discussions are ongoing, and then we can keep framing this perspective.
Thank you. I think mine is not, to make a recommendation, just to try to comment on the questions raised by Ambassador just here on what are the steps. I think for IGAD, as I indicated in my presentation this morning, there is a roadmap that has been approved. And maybe just to make some few remarks on the roadmap. The roadmap, of course, specifies as the first step is to undertake a face-to-face meeting with the principals with a view to, of course, secure a ceasefire. That is one of the key elements within the roadmap, but also the issue of facilitating the political dialogue with the non-belligerents, which had indicated non-belligerents, the civil society, mobilizing them to be in position to. And I'd highlighted that that process will, of course, be done jointly with the AU, and it will take two steps. One is, of course, having that engagement with them to prepare them to map out the program of work, and then, of course, with the view that that would then translate into a more inclusive political dialogue process, a broader political dialogue process. But within the roadmap, also there are considerations for, of course, a ceasefire mechanism that would deal with the issues of cessation of hostilities, protection of civilians, and issues to do with monitoring of the humanitarian access. But more importantly, from the policy level, of course, we have the quartet, which is the summit decision of, of the heads of state, the four countries, but below them, they have activated the IGAD Quartet Council of Ministers, who met once. And during their meeting, of course, they highlighted the importance of mapping out the agenda, identifying the participants, the venue for the talks, but also the program of work. So this, including, of course, the identification of a substantive special envoy for Sudan. As I earlier communicated, currently there is the IGAD special envoy for South Sudan, Ambassador Ismail Wais, who is working closely with the Executive Secretary to follow up on the Sudan peace process, including the participation of IGAD in the expanded mechanism or the core group. So there are lots of work that is happening behind the scene. Of course, is not in the limelight, as you know, from practice. Before the formal process, there are always lots of back-channel diplomacy, back-channel processes that take place leading up to the official events. So these are just a few highlights of some of the things that are happening. I believe also the chair of the quartet is working, as was highlighted yesterday. Is not sleeping, is working, and a lot of work is actually happening. Only that probably it is not in the media. Thank you.
Some more points, some more reflections. This is a recommendation, it's a plenary, so we are free to highlight some of the things. As you deliberate that, let me just try and summarize what I've been hearing for a few minutes. And then, okay, thanks.
So thank you very much, moderator. While I may not necessarily have a specific brief to make this intervention that I'm making, but I thought it's important that I footnote what our good friend from IGAD just said, that on our own part as the Republic of Kenya, our president is fully engaged on this matter, being part of the team that was appointed by IGAD to focus specifically on matters of resolving that conflict in the Sudan. And I just want to confirm that the last point that he made reference to about a lot of work being done behind the scenes, that it is indeed true. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. And we look forward to seeing some traction by way of seeing some movement, focusing on quite a number of areas that will help us or help the great people of the Sudan find peace. So at this point, I think that's what I thought I should underscore and say that, yes, we are fully engaged, and our president is fully determined to get some traction working. Thank you.
This is quite an interesting session to chair, really. But do we have some hands? Yes. This is our last session for recommendations, so please feel free to put a few recommendations, and then I'll try and summarize, and then we can aim to conclude in a few minutes. Thanks.
Thank
you have the floor.
A lot has been said, and listening to the experts in the room, and also across and around the region, it's quite evident that the expertise exists in the region, and we see the ongoing efforts in the region, either from the African Union or IGAD. But I think this is an opportunity for all other actors who want to support Sudan or looking to supporting Sudan, whether Dr. Duncan, I think, had mentioned something to do with settlement and resolution, whichever it is, to rally behind a certain initiative and to rally behind the ongoing efforts and to increase their support to the ongoing efforts and see where the gaps are and how they can support. We have the European Union, international organizations, you have the United Nations. I think it's an opportunity for all these actors to come together to collaborate and to harmonize the approaches and the ongoing efforts. I also see an opportunity. We've been seeing through the presentations, but also in the report and the facts that exist, that Sudan has been in conflict for the longest time. And I think this right now here, the processes that are ongoing, is an opportunity for peacemakers and peace-building practitioners to look into conflict transformation, how to transform the societies in Sudan at large, to move from that mentality or the mindset of conflict into a more peaceful society that looks to address the issues through dialogue and talks. Also see an opportunity for meaningful and participatory inclusion. However large Sudan is, I think there is an opportunity for including all the states and their representatives in peace building and in conflict transformation. I see a role for the African Union. There is a role for IGAD on trying to take that leadership to facilitate the negotiations. But there's a role for the African Union where IGAD doesn't have a reach. When you look to the west of, which one is west? East, west. Of Sudan, you have Chad, Central African Republic, Egypt, Libya, and this could be a role for the African Union to monitor and to manage the expectation of the neighbors of the Gulf, OIC, Arab League, and all these other actors. Also, I see an opportunity to bring on board eminent personalities as well as elders, respected elders, not forgetting diplomats to the table as well to rally behind ongoing efforts and initiatives. And lastly, I think we've talked about and we have seen all these parallel processes for Sudan, but in a way that could work if there were linkages and mechanisms that try to provide a platform where these processes feed into each other. These are all hopeful, notes, but those are my 2 cents regarding all the conversation we had, the discussions we've had, and maybe the way forward for the peace building practitioners and peacemakers.
Thank you very much. Before I summarize, do you have any, please make your interventions pointed and short and crisp.
Well, my name is Evan Sumbisa. I'll be short. Mine is to ask the international governments to lift the ban or the sanctions against Sudan. That will open ways of how the leaders can also move around and interact and get new ideas on how to solve their issues. 2 is about the failing states that are around Sudan to pave way for the stable states that are just below Sudan or up there to come in now and try to help Sudan, other than they are failing and trying to stabilize a failing government. So I don't think 2 blind people can help each other.
Thank you for your perspective. Do you have other contributions? Okay, I'll try and summarize. Well, Professor Kamutai.
Thank you very much. For me, I see 2 basic processes that should be going on. The process that IGAD has already mentioned of identifying delegates and so on, all the stakeholders. Then the second key process should be the negotiations between the different interests. IGAD interest, AU interest, UN interest, state interest, and so on. There should be a parallel forum where these interests are merged, they are negotiated, and then one goal is agreed on, so that by the time the process starts, there are no disagreements that undermine decision-making and moving the process forward. Thank you.
We're also coming very close to the end of our session. Do you have any last-minute recommendations or solutions you'd like to? All right. Rahel, please go ahead.
Thank you. Just a brief one on mediation. We discussed yesterday at length the diverse mediators that exist and the parallel processes. So it would be for the mediators to back up the most legitimate, both politically, as well as to the parties, the most legitimate mediator. The way, for example, IGAD Plus was organized for South Sudan. And then it's also to identify the complementarity between the different mediation processes so we can optimize on the different discussions and the outcomes can be consolidated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any hand up? Okay, let me summarize and then I will leave the podium in a bit. From this session, and also from previous sessions, and it's not my role to do a summary really of the discussions, but I'm just using this to situate a bit of the recommendations that are coming out here. Throughout the 1.5 days, there is no doubt that the Sudan situation is complex. It's a crisis. But given the perspectives around finding, from crisis to resolution, there have been a couple of recommendations that have come forward. I'll attempt to summarize them and also input a few thoughts. One, humanitarian issues are very, very important moving forward. And of course, the different presentations that have been made on this table, the question of resources has been raised as an important question, right? But also beyond resources, the question of coordination is coming out as an important factor. When it comes to ceasefire, again, the processes, and Dr. Walter has mentioned the ongoing roadmap that will speak to how the process moves on and so on. Again, this also is speaking to the complexities of the mediation process. Do all the actors have a thorough analysis of the conflict history, the dynamics, the protagonists, but more importantly, the potentials for peacemaking? So important to think through that, and I think the discussions moving out of this conversation are raising those. An important point that is also coming out of these recommendations, and also from the previous discussions, is the question of better coordination mechanisms. Previous speakers spoke to multiple interventions, the Jeddah process, the IGAD process, and the bilaterals, and also the backroom channels. So the point, I think, coming out here really is better coordination mechanisms. And there was, of course, a mention of African solutions to African problems, which is the mantra of the African Union. And because of that, then questions of division of labor, complementarity, subsidiarity become important. So I think the takeaway here is to harmonize and have one coordinated approach. There is also a point around thinking beyond the conflict resolution phase and anticipating a conflict transformation process. Once the conflict has been stabilized for a bit, and how do we think around the whole process? Of course, academics and policy practitioners within peace studies acknowledge that that is actually a very difficult path, conflict transformation. How do you think about power dynamics? How do you address situations such as structural violence? How do you transform these conflicts from negative peace to positive peace, long-term processes? So I think it's important to have those in mind. I think an important point is also being raised around leadership, who takes the role, who takes the important role of mediating, that process, who is the most legitimate actor in that process, and so on. There are also broad questions around issues of governance, paying attention to governance processes, and so on. And also acknowledgement that in diplomacy there are multiple channels. Some do not have to be, in the media attention. The backroom sessions and discussions are important. I just wanted to end on a note that has also been raised in between here. There has been conversations around responsibility to protect, and I know that's a controversial question to put in the debate, but I think it is important, particularly in the context of the African peace and security architecture. Scholars and practitioners and diplomats in the room, you're familiar with some of the discussions that the pillars rather. You'll talk about, of course, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, the Continental Early Warning Mechanisms, the Panel of the Wise, and related structures. We now have the African Peace Fund. So to what extent are these, especially the Peace Fund, to what extent, Walter, maybe that could be a takeaway question, to what extent is the African Peace Fund that is now operational, supporting some of the interventions on board? Before I also came to this meeting, I just did a bit of homework. At the UN level, there is a framework, there's a guidance for effective mediation. IGAD also has a mediation tool, right? That has also been developed over time out of research processes. To what extent are we also using, these handbooks? The African Union also has a handbook that stipulates, how do we do mediation, how do we train, how do we engage in capacity development, and so on. So what are the aspects that we need to pay attention to? Again, just to end on this note, and we do not, have the opportunity, Walter and the team, to have, had an opportunity to look at the roadmap. But we have an agenda, an agreed agenda for negotiation, because that is important. And then now pushing the buyout, of the different actors. Again, there was a conversation around civil society and their engagement. How do you bring all these different actors, again, in the spirit of meaningful participation and inclusion? On that note, I would like to surrender my microphone and hand over to the moderator, to the conveners, and thanks very much the Horn Institute and Konrad Adenauer and the different partners in the room for making this quite exciting and informative. It's just 1.5 days, so we cannot really exhaust things, but we'll be happy to hear the next steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mwangi, Dr. Ojwang, and Professor Zakaria. Could we please give them a round of applause? I hope everyone is still energetic after the 1.5 days of interaction. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear distinguished guests, my name is Angela Kasekende, one of the project managers at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Regional Program Security Dialogue for East Africa. It is a great pleasure as Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to be able to provide a platform in partnership with the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies to present and discuss the pressing matters in our neighboring country, Sudan. This conference has brought together experts from different parts of Africa, Europe, to discuss the topics on the history of Sudan, as we heard from yesterday, the current dynamics and root causes of the Sudan conflict, its impact, the refugee crisis, and responses from the African continent and the international community. When we think about from crisis to resolution, how can we as African nations and the international community contribute to resolving and possibly put an end to the war in Sudan? This is a question that we should continue to reflect on, each one of us. What can I do as a person, as an institution? We all come from different institutions. We're all gathered here today. Let us strive to have one voice on this matter. How can we play our part in contributing to the Africa we want to see? We want to be a peaceful continent. We don't want war, we don't want deaths, we want peace. So as mentioned yesterday, by saving Sudan, we are saving the region. We should be intentional when we talk about mediation processes, and we should also involve youth leaders in the mediation process. It shouldn't just be efforts of international leaders or continent or the leaders on this continent, but it should be intergenerational efforts to stop conflict on the continent. We all know that the conflict in Sudan is a complex one. One needs to understand the genesis of the crisis to find a way forward to a solution, a resolution. So this is why we're here today. As CAS, we are here to hear from you. Let's continue to talk about this process. And the solution cannot be obtained from just this two-day conference, but it can help us think critically on the possible solutions and interventions. So on behalf of CAS, I would like to thank the moderators, for making this session so interactive, and also for the presenters for giving us an insight on the different topics. I would like to thank the participants for taking the time from their busy schedule to be with us here today. I would like to thank the service providers who are here today and the hotel for giving us this venue to have this conference. I would like to thank the whole CAST team from Kampala, Europe, Kenya, for the wonderful support in the preparation for this conference. And last but not least, I would like to thank the Horn Institute and the whole organizing committee for their hard work to make sure that this conference is a success. I would like to actually ask the people who've been involved in the preparation for this conference to just stand up for everyone to see you, if that's okay. The whole committee, please. Could you please give him a round of applause? As you can see, the team is quite youthful, including Dr. Kanenji. So thank you very much, and safe travels back home to everyone. So I'd invite Dr. Kanenji to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Angela. Please, let's give her another round of applause. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity again to thank all of you for being able to sacrifice the last 1.5 days. Some of you have sacrificed more than that because you had to fly in from abroad, some on the continent, others from outside, for a singular mission of trying to contribute to this important discussion. The organized committee, as Angela has mentioned, thank you very much. Also fundamentally others who may have contributed certain intangibles towards the realization of this forum, especially coming at a time when most of us were frozen in our beds because of a couple of years of COVID. And so as it opened up, we're finding ourselves again. Now we come here for a regional dialogue, a conversation. There is, in African philosophic sagacity, they say wherever there is wise men, in generic form of the word, nothing goes wrong. Panapo wazee hapaharibiki neno. A forum such as this one provides that. Not because nothing goes wrong, but the meaning is, even if something goes wrong, there is always a solution. And in African diplomacy, there's a requirement that you have to talk and talk until the cows come home, because there is no alternative to dialogue. A number of things emerged. Yes, there is a consensus that we're facing a challenge in the region, but critically, that Sudan is too important, is too big for us to allow it to fail. If it fails, as Africans, we would have failed in our own fundamental philosophies and assumptions. That I am because you are, and you are because we are. We would have failed our brothers and sisters in Sudan, but we would also have failed ourselves because of that Ubuntu spirit. It is clear that there is a sense there should be a united approach. There is a recognition that multiplicity of efforts are not aiding towards resolution. It's at a time like this that calls for urgent action. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, it's the fierce urgency of now. While Dr. King was speaking to the ills of segregation, that goes back to America's original sin, the ills of the 60s, the sins of America's 60s or 50s are not exclusive to that society at that time. We confront that challenge all over the world. Are we ready to respond to that call, to that urgency? And therefore, ours is not to wonder in bewilderment on the scale of the challenge that we face, but we need instead to seek to confront it, such that years from today, when history is going to be written, generations from now will say, when we were confronted with the challenge of losing our nation states, our communities, we stood up, had the courage and fortitude to confront that challenge, and we came out on top. But no matter how high the hills were, indeed, we say to ourselves, we shall overcome, and yes, we did overcome it. Because where these challenges are great, and the conflict in Sudan is complex, it's not insurmountable. We've been down that road before. Sometimes we've acted, sometimes we haven't. But anytime we've acted, we've always seen progress. The Black Hawk Down story made us run away from Somalia, much of the international community. That contributed to the genocide in Rwanda. The moment we don't take action where there is a challenge in one part of our world, a lot of times it comes home to hurt us. And yes, we ignored Afghanistan because it was far away in some mountains in Tora Bora. But 9/11 reminded us that there is no challenge out there that may not come home to affect us. And that makes us to call on everybody that let this not be the end, this is the beginning. And indeed, for us at the Institute and our partners, this is just the beginning of this conversation, of this effort. And it should not end here, neither should we get tired. As wise men once said, it's better to sweat in peace than to bleed in war. I appreciate all the efforts you've made. Thank you very much for coming. We're looking forward to sharing the report from this with most of you, actually all of you, but we're going to have some policy briefs to share with some of you, depending, of course, on the role and the organization that you play, since some of it is going to be task-specific or function-specific. We're looking forward to convening another session, perhaps not in this hotel, and perhaps not even in Kenya, but that speaks to the same, because the process of trying to heal the crisis we're facing in Sudan just begun. We cannot allow to get our eye off the target. No one else is going to come from Mars or Jupiter to fix the problem in Sudan. It is our problem. We own it, and with God's grace upon us, we are going to solve it. Thank you very much. Please stay for lunch and interact and network. Thank you.
What are the changing dynamics of terrorism and violent extremism in Africa? How does the expanded ideological foundations that include politicization of religion look like in Africa? What are the roles of external
Why is sustainable peace and security so elusive in the
on the Horn of Africa region.
We also engage in strategic communication for preventing and countering terrorism, as well as responding to conflicts and emerging threats.
Some of our focus areas include security, diplomacy, and terrorism.
We carry out action-oriented.
What are the major security issues in the Horn of Africa today?
What are the changing dynamics of terrorism and violent extremism in Africa? How does the expanded ideological foundations that include politicization of religion look like in Africa?
What are the roles of internal and external actors in the conflict dynamics in the region?
Why is sustainable peace and security so elusive in the Horn of Africa region?
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies is a non-partisan research and policy think-do tank that is responding to some of these challenges.
The Horn Institute.
Horn Institute.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Horn of International Institute for Strategic Studies.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
As a think-do tank, the Horn contributes to the philosophy and methodology of active research, an interactive inquiry process balancing problem-solving actions and research through critical reflections.
We provide informed, evidence-based, and problem-solving policy research and analysis on the Horn of Africa region.
We also engage in strategic communication for preventing and countering terrorism, as well as responding to conflicts and emerging threats.
Some of our focus areas include security, diplomacy, and terrorism.
We carry out action-oriented research in order to help inform policy making and action in defense and security in this region.
We focus on governance, statecraft, cross-border crimes, and strategic threats in 13 countries in the region.
We also study the ideological structures of violent extremist propaganda and develop counter and alternative narratives.
The Horn Academy regularly delivers tailor-made trainings on themes relating to the Institute's focus areas of defense and security, diplomacy and foreign relations, governance, statecraft and conflict management, transnational crimes and threats, and terrorism and violent extremism.
When I was selecting an organization to grow my knowledge and research skills, the Horn Institute was an easy choice for me. I like the Institute's rigor and depth in research and teamwork.
The Horn Institute is a highly professional organization offering a very supportive environment for research.
Because of the reach and impact of our work, we were recently ranked number 18 as a think tank to watch by the Global Think Tank Index.
The Institute's convening power and the quality of its products makes it one of the leading think tanks in the region.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, objective, independent, definitive.
What are the major security issues in the Horn of Africa today?
What are the changing dynamics of terrorism and violent extremism in Africa? How does their expanded ideological foundations that include politicization of religion look like in Africa?
What are the roles of internal and external actors in the conflict dynamics in the region?
Why is sustainable peace and security so elusive in the Horn of Africa region?
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies is a non-partisan research and policy think tank that is responding to some of these challenges.
The Horn Institute.
Horn Institute.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Horn of International Institute.
International Institute for Strategic Studies.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
As a think tank, the Horn contributes to the philosophy and methodology of active research, an interactive inquiry process balancing problem-solving actions and research through critical reflections.
We provide informed, evidence-based, and problem-solving policy research and analysis on the Horn of Africa region.
We also engage in strategic communication for preventing and countering terrorism, as well as responding to conflicts and emerging threats.
Some of our focus areas include security, diplomacy, and terrorism.
We carry out action-oriented research in order to help inform policy making and action in defense and security in this region.
We focus on governance, statecraft, cross-border crimes, and strategic threats in 13 countries in the region.
We also study the ideological structures of violent extremist propaganda and develop counter and alternative narratives.
The Horn Academy regularly delivers tailor-made trainings on themes relating to the Institute's focus areas of defense and security, diplomacy and foreign relations, governance, statecraft and conflict management, transnational crimes and threats, and terrorism and violent extremism.
When I was selecting an organization to grow my knowledge and research skills, the Horn Institute was an easy choice for me. I like the Institute's rigor and depth in research and teamwork.
The Horn Institute is a highly professional organization offering a very supportive environment for research.
Because of the reach and impact of our work, we were recently ranked number 18 as a think tank to watch by the Global Think Tank Index.
The Institute's convening power and the quality of its products makes it one of the leading think tanks in the region.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, objective, independent, definitive.
What are the major security issues in the Horn of Africa today?
What are the changing dynamics of terrorism and violent extremism in Africa? How does their expanded ideological foundations that include politicization of religion look like in Africa?
What are the roles of internal and external actors in the conflict dynamics in the region?
Why is sustainable peace and security so elusive in the Horn of Africa region.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies is a non-partisan research and policy think-do tank that is responding to some of these challenges.
The Horn Institute.
Horn Institute.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Horn of International Institute for Strategic Studies.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
The Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies.
As a think-do tank, the Horn contributes to the philosophy and methodology of active research, an interactive inquiry process balancing problem-solving actions and research through critical reflections.
We provide informed, evidence-based, and problem-solving policy research and analysis on the Horn of Africa region.
We also engage in strategic communication for preventing and countering terrorism, as well as responding to conflicts and emerging threats.
Some of